laboratory practices. Okay, so as in the previous slides or in the previous class, also in the previous module, we have discussed that for conducting the preclinical studies, because these preclinical studies, they are conducted in laboratory. Okay, so for that, good laboratory practice guidelines are followed. Okay, so these good laboratory practice guidelines are the guidelines which are very easy and simple to understand, and just for your understanding purpose, you can have knowledge about these GLP guidelines. But when you will actually write the format, like when I will show you that how you can write a non-clinical study report. So when you see that, so in that just a statement is written that for conducting these for conducting these preclinical studies, good laboratory practice guidelines are being followed. Okay, so the term good laboratory practice GLP refers to a quality management system that addresses the organizational procedures and environmental factors that influence how non-clinical laboratory experiments are organized, carried out, monitored, recorded, reported, and preserved. GLP makes sure that the safety test data that is presented to the government for the granting of research permits, it is of top notch and integrity. So the GLP guidelines, it is a guidelines which is generally refers to the quality management system of any drug when it is produced. But these GLP guidelines are also means any study which is done in a laboratory, like during the quality management and quality assurance and quality control, also when the tests are performed in the laboratory, so at that point also the good laboratory practice guidelines are followed. So any experiment, any test, any procedure, when it is done in a laboratory, so for that the good laboratory practice guidelines are followed. Okay, so these good laboratory practice guidelines are also followed for conducting the preclinical studies. The scope of GMP and GLP differs from one another. While good laboratory practice only relates to the safety testing phase, good production factor or it is not good production factor. The guideline is good manufacturing practice is applicable throughout the full drug manufacturing process. The Food and Drug Administration, FDA, in the United States enforces GMP and GLP. Okay, so while the GLP practice or GLP guidelines, they are only followed related to the safety testing phase, then GMP is applicable throughout the full drug manufacturing process, and throughout the full drug manufacturing process, so it is followed for drug manufacturing, for cosmetics, for medical devices also. And these two guidelines are enforced and governed by FDA in the United States. Now, good laboratory practice. So below is the FDA guidance to help research laboratories determine if a specific study or activity must comply with good laboratory practice. So GLP compliance required: studies on animal health products, overdoses studies in the target species, animal safety studies in the target species, tissue residue accumulation and depletion studies, and under irradiation studies. So now on the animal health products, like the products which are to be used on animals, so these studies are done, that is overdose studies in the target species, the animal safety studies in the target species, the tissue residue accumulation and depletion studies, and the under irritation studies. Then when safety studies done to determine the potential drug abuse characteristic of a test article are required to be submitted to the FDA as a part of an application for a research or marketing purpose permit. So in case the report is submitted with some drugs, especially the the drugs which are used in psychological disorders, that they do not cause any kind of drug abuse. There are certain drugs which can cause drug dependence, and which leads to the illegal use of drugs, and it leads to the abuse use of drugs. So for that, it is to be submitted to the regulatory authority, that a report is submitted to the regulatory authority that the drug does not cause any kind of drug abuse. Then chemical procedures used to characterize the test article, to determine the stability of the test article and its mixtures, and to determine the homogeneity and concentration of test article mixtures. Okay. So now the chemical procedures are conducted with the reagents and all to characterize the test article, also to determine the stability of the test article, the concentration of the test article. So for that purpose, the GL, so and all these studies are conducted in the laboratory. For that purpose, it is required that when these studies are conducted, they should be GLP compliant. Then GLP compliance not required when validation trials conducted to confirm the analytical methods used to determine the concentration of test article in human tissues and drug doses form. So under these conditions, it is not required to follow the GLP guidelines, although these studies are also conducted in a laboratory, but it is not very well required or very much required to follow the GLP guidelines. Okay. So now the validation trials conducted to confirm the clinical analytical methods which are used to determine the concentration of test articles in animal tissues and doses form, when the studies of cosmetic products are done, when organoleptic evaluation of processed foods are done, when the work is done to develop chemical methods of analysis and the chemical procedures which are used to analyze the specimens, like in clinical chemistry and urine analysis. So these are the certain methods or procedures in which the GLP compliance is not required. So that is just for your knowledge purpose. In medical writing, it is rarely asked that where the GLP is required and where the GLP is not required. But for conducting the preclinical studies, when they are conducted in the laboratory, you have to follow the GLP guidelines are followed, and just a statement you have to mention in the preclinical report that the GLP guidelines are being followed while conducting this study. A statement is just mentioned, that's it. Organoleptic properties means the sensory analysis, like when you, with the smell, with the taste, you give the properties. Generally, it is done with foods. Okay, what is the smell of the food? What is the say, like with your senses, what you can examine, that is the organoleptic properties. So OECD and GLP guidelines. So the methodology of non-clinical studies overlaps significantly with that of industrial toxicity testing. Hence, regulatory agencies expect organizations for economic cooperation and development, OECD GLP guidelines, to be characterized if considered, if applicable. Now this OECD, the guidelines which are given by OECD GLP guidelines are generally the guidelines which are followed for conducting the preclinical testing. So I'll provide you the link of those GLP guidelines so that you can go through it whenever you have time. They are written in a very easy and simple language. You will easily understand it. Because if we will discuss it in the class, it will take a lot of time, and it is not very, the discussion of the GLP guidelines is not very much important from medical writing point of view.